We are back on Morning Line. Thanks for joining us. Our guests this morning, defense attorneys Kevin Tietz and Joey Fuzon. And the topic at hand, you see marijuana in Tennessee, but the larger topic at hand this morning, essentially, with the way things are going right now, are amounts of marijuana, misdemeanor amounts, which is less than half an ounce, legal in Tennessee right now, in so many words. Neither one of you would say it's legal in Tennessee. But practically speaking, based on the way the TBI is testing amounts confiscated, if they can't prove that it's marijuana, they can't prosecute, can they?
They cannot, no. I agree.
All right, so give me a scenario by which maybe someone's busted for marijuana. You were talking about this during the break. A traffic stop.
Sure, yeah, and we get these every day, Kevin and I do, and lawyers across the state get these cases where somebody's pulled over, the officer approaches the window, and they smell cannabis. It used to be they smelled marijuana. Okay. Now the argument is they smell cannabis. And once they smell cannabis, they will start asking the person, you know, you got any marijuana in the car? You've been smoking marijuana? What do I smell here? And admissions at that point, in light of what we know now, are damaging, and they will usually get the person to admit it. They will confiscate it. They'll search the vehicle. They'll search the person. You know, a lot of times they'll even seize the cell phone if they feel like it's an amount that would, or it's packaged in a way that would be for resale. And the person in that situation is now faced with either being arrested or being cited on the scene. And their admissions, in essence, are now the biggest problem.
Okay, is an admission, and again, this goes back to the old story you always hear: if you're in trouble, clam up. Don't say anything to anyone. That's the way it should be until things move forward, which is your right to do. But if they admit it, that certainly can be used against them. But would they still have to test the plant material?
Well, I would say that they would, because
you would argue that if it
yeah,
moved forward.
Absolutely. Because what the defendant doesn't know what level of THC is in the substance either.
Right.
And unless they're able to prove that it's greater than 0.03 level of THC, that it's not hemp, then it can't be prosecuted as marijuana. So I would argue that it would still need to be tested, even if there was an admission, because you know the defendant doesn't know what level of THC is most likely in whatever the plant substance is.
And neither does the officer. You made the key point that when they make that stop, it's no longer a stop where they smell marijuana. They smell cannabis, which means it could be either marijuana or hemp. Now, you saw in our story, the TBI has a new field test where the officers can put it in a test tube and shake it, and if it's marijuana, it'll turn purple. I think if it's hemp, it turns orange. Now, that just tells you that it's hemp or marijuana, but it doesn't necessarily how much THC is in each of the plant products.
No,
right?
And there's actually two tests they mentioned. One of them is kind of they're both reagent tests, where the first one actually can indicate that it's cannabis itself. Now, there's all kinds of problems with that test because it also hits on a bunch of different other plant materials, but it gives you kind of a plus or minus. Yes, it's cannabis, or yes, it's not. The new test they rolled out that they explained in their memo, this Swiss test or the 4AP test, it goes a step further. What it does is the ratio test, so it tests the ratio of CBD and THC. And right now, the cannabis plant is generally going to have high in one or the other. It's going to be high in CBD, which is your hemp, or it's going to be high in THC, which is your recreational and medical marijuana. It's not going to be high in both yet.
Okay.
But
it won't say definitively the level, whether it's 0.3% or more or something like that.
Correct. So
they still have to do that more extensive testing back in the lab, which is what they're only going to do in felony amounts now.
Assumingly, that's just for them to meet a probable cause standard to say whether or not it's marijuana. I would say is what that field test is supposed to.
But that won't alone be enough in court. You need to have the
probable cause may be enough for an arrest or a citation, but the standard, if you're going to take this to a jury trial, is going to be beyond a reasonable doubt. It's going to be a much, much higher standard. I mean, they're going to have scientific evidence from the lab to prove what level of THC is in the substance.
Do you think when officers make these arrests, and I understand under these circumstances they're doing their job, I have no qualms with that, but do you think they'll have some frustration when they bring these folks in and then they're seeing the cases potentially are being dismissed because the testing's not being done on them?
Yeah, I think we're going to see, as time will tell, right? We're going to see these citations and arrests occur. We're going to see lawyers hopefully now stand up and say, I'm going to demand to see the test results before I advise my client. And you're going to start seeing that. And I think officers will be somewhat frustrated, or they're going to take a different approach and they're going to start really investigating at the scene whether it's marijuana or hemp, looking for other indicators, emissions like we talked about. But there's other indicators. If you're purchasing hemp from a store, a lot of times there's packaging that goes with it. So the officers are going to look to see if there's packaging with it. So people who are buying and consuming hemp flower or any other type of edible or something like that needs to have that stuff with them to avoid that confusion. I mean, that to protect them. But officers are going to be looking, and I think if they don't see that stuff stuff, they're going to assume or they're going to believe that it's marijuana.
Right, and the point here is there are going to be people busted legitimately for marijuana. The question is going to be proving it and moving forward if it's a misdemeanor amount. How about the prosecutors, like DAs? What do you think?
Well, I think it's going to be a patchwork of different approaches, is what I predict. You're going to have some DAs that are going to see the memo for what it is, recognize it the same way that we see it, and not move forward on prosecuting with the cases. I suspect that Nashville may be one of those counties. I think other counties you're going to see DAs focus on the last sentence that's in that TBI press release, where they say that marijuana is absolutely illegal and illegal in any forms. But even if that's the case, even if the DAs in some counties do double down on not allowing any leeway for marijuana,
moving forward with prosecution, you guys will fight them on it.
They still have the burden of proof. The burden is still on the state to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, and they're still going to be held to the standard of having to show what the level of THC is in that product. So even if they're moving forward, it would probably be a delayed or an extended time for when somebody could potentially get their case resolved to a dismissal in those counties. It's not going to be something that's going to happen quick.
Right.
But ultimately, if you were to wait the case out and make the state prove their case, if they don't have the evidence to prosecute, if they don't have the results from the lab, how can they move forward?
And they're not going to want to spend the money on this for some nickel bag or something like this. By the way, these are jury trials? No, they're judges only, right, in the misdemeanor cases making the ruling?
No.
Or is it a jury?
You can get it, absolutely.
Oh, you can? There can be juries that hear this. Okay.
Well, and I think it's also important to note that, you're going to have, if the DA's office does decide to double down and really prosecute these misdemeanor small level 2 or 3 gram type cases, you're going to have to submit it in general sessions, I would argue, to the testing labs. And right now for alcohol testing, the TBI takes
it's
60 to 90 days for the initial test. If you want toxicology on it, 6 to 8 months. So the idea of requiring people to come to court, tying up the resources in court, tying up the prosecutors and the judges and the clerks to wait around for testing to be done on 2 grams of cannabis seems ridiculous.
Let's see what some of our viewers think. We'll go to Ann. Ann, good morning. Hi, Ann.
Good morning. Bear with me a second. My experience was with high school students. And in my experience, I saw drug dogs hit on bad rubber cement. I saw a hand wipe test positive for THC, and then later saw it be thrown out because of inaccurate findings. My thinking right now is that memo that came out last week is going to see a lot of people be not arrested as adults when they are caught with small amounts. Will the same thing be done to students in schools? Because I see this being a problem for SROs, because our students are wise enough to carry a small enough amount, and they are wise enough to know that they will not be able to distinguish between hemp and marijuana.
Okay, that's an interesting question. And again, most students, we're talking felony amounts of the big ones, the dealers. I think most people say, yeah, you go after them. Anyone with lesser amounts. Now, I don't like the idea of any student, underage kid, being with booze, marijuana, anything anyway. But what about her point?
Yeah, I mean, it would be a juvenile matter. Any person under the age of 18, the cases are handled in juvenile court. Only really serious cases go up to criminal court.
But wouldn't they still have to meet the standard of proof regardless of where it is, whether or not that student was caught with something? Don't they still have to prove it's marijuana as opposed to hemp?
Maybe not. So in juvenile court, it's called a delinquent act. It's not a crime. They're in detention. They're not in jail. It's toned down a little bit. And I would argue, yeah, they would still need to prove that it was something illegal or something bad. But I would say in juvenile court, it's going to be a little less in the sense of if it's considered a delinquent act, if you're carrying something that could be either or. There may be still some consequences. But no, I still think the same thing would apply as far as the testing.
And I don't know the law on the show for hemp. You still have have to be held to.
Oh, that's a good question too.
Yeah.
I should know that, but I think
Governor
it may
Lee-
be along the lines of cigarettes in terms of ingesting. I mean, the gummies
is.
and everything like that. It's controlled for older folks.
Governor Lee signed the Smoking Prevention of Tobacco, Hemp, and Vape Products. They amended the bill, I think, this spring, and it put hemp on the same level as nicotine or as tobacco.
It would
So
be
18 or older.
18 year olds.
So
Okay.
presumptively, the juveniles is. I mean,
Then
they're,
that shouldn't be
they're in
there.
trouble for something either way, even if it is hemp
Good point.
or if it is marijuana. So.
I mean, they can be in trouble for being late to curfew. I mean, there's a lot of things that a juvenile could be in trouble for that
Okay.
wouldn't rise to a crime for an adult.
Gotcha. That's a good question, Ann.
Yeah, very good question.
Let's go to Jesse. Jesse, good morning, Jesse.
How you doing, sir?
Hey, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I like what y'all saying about the marijuana situation. I'm glad that they're cleaning up off the streets, sir. Hello?
Yeah, go ahead. You're saying what now?
Yes, sir. I like what you said about the marijuana situation and everything. I'm glad they're cleaning it off the streets.
What do you mean cleaning it off the streets?
I mean, I'm glad it's not legal in Nashville.
Oh, I see. Okay, well, I mean, marijuana is not legal anywhere. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, yes. Thank you.
Okay, all right. So I'm not sure if I wasn't sure if he was for or against the idea of this, but I was waiting, and I know some people responded on my Facebook page when I posted the story saying, look, and I know you guys maybe don't, you may have personal opinions on this, but I mean, they're saying, look, based on this and how confusing it is for law enforcement, DAs, and the TBI having to send this out and not really wanting to say what it's all about, but saying it's still, that this is another step toward maybe lawmakers on Capitol Hill having to address this issue. Would you agree that at some point they're going to have to look at this and say, now, wait a second, this just doesn't jive?
Absolutely. I think potentially one of the things that could happen as a result of this is that if law enforcement is boggled down with just the consequences or the mental agony, if you will, or just the fact that they're arresting folks on these charges and then the charges are getting dismissed, and that becomes something that just is frustrating them to the point that maybe they complain, and if the Police Chiefs Association and the Sheriff's Association have been two of the biggest groups that have been opposed to medical marijuana bills or any type of legalization bills. If those two entities are hearing from officers in the field that these citations and arrests for misdemeanor amounts are ultimately just doing nothing but wasting resources and wasting officers' times if the cases are getting dismissed. If it gets to the point where those associations and those groups are telling lawmakers, or lawmakers are hearing from officers themselves, that we need to do something because the hemp industry has made it difficult to prosecute for marijuana, that may be the point at which the legislature decides to look at it and says, maybe this is a burden for our law enforcement. I think it's going to have to be something pro-law enforcement or an angle pro-law enforcement to get a lot of the more conservative, more rural legislators to vote for legalization.
I was always kind of perplexed to some degree that it seems so across the board. Now, I ended up talking to Terry Ash, who was president, I think, of the Sheriff's Association for some time. He's now with Homeland Security. I have a lot of respect for that man. And he said it's not so much, there are sheriffs out there, like Darren Hall here in Davidson County, who think, no, this has to be changed. This is not a big deal. I mean, but their concern, I think, is consistency. They're like, at the federal level, there's certain things that's outlawed. There's certain states passing it where it's legal. Here, certain things are legal. And I understand where they're coming from. Sheriff Ash was just saying, Nick, it's just inconsistent, And so we're going to kind of align ourselves with what the federal law is. But then we hear these other things in states, and it's kind of like, which way do we go? I think that's more their frustration. So let's keep it the way it is until we can get some consistent, clear policy telling us some other direction. And I can kind of understand that. I mean, law enforcement, it's either legal or it's not. And they're being told, well, it depends.
Yeah, I hope that, and I think this may come sooner than a full legalization, is the possible decriminalization of small amounts. I mean, we're talking about small amounts of cannabis. We're talking about the difficulty of testing small amounts and the resources. Hopefully, that will result in maybe the rethinking of criminalizing those small amounts.
And that was my next question. I'm glad you brought that up. So, in the state of Tennessee, I frankly am perplexed that they have not yet passed medical marijuana that's very controlled to help folks who need it with seizures or cancer.
Absolutely.
But to me, what you're suggesting there is decriminalizing small amounts is kind of legalizing recreational amount. I get it would be recreational, and I just don't see this state even though some would say it makes sense, being close, at least our lawmakers up there passing anything that's recreational marijuana right
and
now.
they started with the bill several years ago with allowing, and actually we haven't talked about this, there is, you are allowed to have products in the state over 0.3% THC up to 0.9% THC with a medical note if you've got epilepsy and some of that stuff that started.
Certain exceptions.
Certain exceptions, so you can get a little more THC. It was 0.9. They also allow up to 0.6 for research purposes. So, there is some idea or some acceptance of the idea that the cannabis plant can be used for medical purposes. I mean, you see that in children who have those seizures.
Oh, yeah.
And, I mean, you see that. You can actually watch YouTube videos that they give it to them. It's,
I'm so sick and tired of hearing lawmakers say, well, I need more proof. That's crap.
Yeah,
Kids with seizures benefit from this. End of story.
Absolutely.
Listen, we'll take a break. When we come back, we've got Tammy, Kim, Joe, and others who have questions and comments from you. So we'll take a break, be back with more of your calls right after this.